eventually be rolling because it's 9:30. All right, we're live now. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of 2K Weekly, the show where we go over the events of the 2K universe. I'm TaipeiJoey101, joined once again by Danny V. We've had a bit of a hectic week in front of us, a very spooky week. This is the day before All Hallows Eve. So we got a lot to talk about today. Let's start off, dive into our headlines, our top stories today. If you watched the stream last night, we went down to Jacksonville for the Florida-Georgia game. Number 24 Georgia ended up beating the Gators easily, 28-3, with some great defense. Meanwhile, a huge romp in the WAC, but not who you'd think, Long Beach State, completely exposing the Nevada Wolfpack, 80-7 on their homecoming day. Northern Illinois, the Huskies easily steamrolled past Miami, Ohio, who would have been undefeated if they hadn't lost prior to Kent State. 61-33 the final score there. North Texas becomes the first team to clinch their division with a Sun Belt West title thanks to their win over Louisiana Monroe. They're currently sitting with the best conference record in the Sun Belt. They'll punch their ticket to New Orleans to face the winner of the Sun Belt East, which will likely be decided this week as Coastal Carolina takes on FAU. Meanwhile, the Big East and North is now officially a two-horse race. UConn and UMass are the two frontrunners after the UMass Minutemen beat the Orange in 3 overtimes, a score we'll get to. The Conference USA completely shaken up after Memphis is upset by Houston. Now Southern Miss is the heavy frontrunner. Though Memphis can still win the division if they beat the Golden Eagles later on this year. Meanwhile, the Big 12 North, our final top story, is still wide open thanks to a Kansas upset of Colorado. It's now a 4-way race for the division between the Jayhawks, Buffaloes, as well as Nebraska and Kansas State. Danny, what's your big story from this week?
Biggest story would be definitely North Texas. I mean, being the first team to clinch the conference championship spot this early of the season, that's quite impressive for any team. But of course, the most fun one would have to be, the Big 12 and their constant struggle to see who will come out on top.
Mm-hmm. It's really a race to see who plays Oklahoma State in that conference championship. Let's start with our scores. We're doing a little something different. We figured that we'd streamline the graphics from here on out. But before we get to that, once again, we want to remind you 2KU is on Tumblr. Don't forget to check out the tumblr.com/2KUniverse at 2KUniverse on Tumblr. You can get access to a bunch of other exclusive content. And also, don't forget to stay tuned on this channel. We have another video coming out within the coming weeks for the 2KU Introduction to College Basketball. It's definitely a video you don't want to miss. So stay tuned on that. Let's now move on to our scores this week. We're doing a 4 on a slide here. A bit of a rapid fire way to introduce some games. We're going to start in Atlanta. The Georgia State Panthers, the big surprise story of the Sun Belt Conference. They were sitting at 5-2 when they welcomed the Florida Atlantic Owls into town. The Owls, however, had different plans for the Panthers and ended their miracle run 34-27, the final score. The Owls improved to a 7-1 record, which would be the best in the conference if not for their conference rival, Coastal Carolina, who they'll face next week Danny, how does this affect the conference championship race, and can FAU pull off a big win?
FAU can pull off a big win, especially because this week it is taking place at Florida Atlantic. So Coastal Carolina might be coming into a big home crowd in Boca.
This is probably the biggest game of the Owl season. FAU's one loss, if you remember, was to Western Kentucky, a team who's effectively slipped out of conference contention. We'll check in now to a team who is taking the conference by storm. The Temple Owls improved to 6-2 in conference, rattling off 5 straight wins. For a perfect conference record, they beat the Rutgers Scarlet Knights 30-27 in overtime. The Owls are now the heavy frontrunners in the South. They have all but clinched it. All they need now is a Villanova loss to cement themselves a spot in East Rutherford for the conference championship game. Danny, what do you think makes this Temple team special?
Well, for stars number one, they are scoring a lot. Like, for example, currently looking at the B standings, that Temple, they have one of the best scoring offense in the conference. They're actually number 4 in the conference.
And do you think, and effectively right now, Rutgers is now on the outskirts of the conference championship run, especially in that packed Big 12 North. Danny, what do you have to say about Rutgers?
I think that they are now in a disappointment time of their season. Could they still make it? It has to be a lot of chaos. But that means that both UConn, UMass, and Syracuse have to lose all their remaining games. So, but effectively, they're pretty much out of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's head down to Richmond. The Richmond Spiders welcoming the Howard Bison of the MEAC into town, and a huge upset. 32-31, the Howard Bison. Not even one of the better teams in the MEAC typically, but they managed to pull off a big win, a big upset over the FBS Richmond Spiders. Not the first FCS FBS upset we've seen this year, but the first one being, we did have one earlier with Kennesaw State and Ole Miss. But this Howard team now a big win like this always cements yourself as a contender. And for an HBCU like Howard, this is a very important game. We saw how scarily close you can get to losing to an HBCU. Take Southern Miss's game against the Southern Jaguars as an example. Danny, any thoughts on Richmond and Howard?
Richmond really is now disappointing themselves because this was kind of like their quote unquote freebie game, considering it's an FCS opponent, but now they lost by 1 point, kind of now diminishing their season a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's head down to the Illabut game, one of the best rivalries in the Big Ten that no one's talking about. But now it's bigger than ever. Ohio State, reeling from a loss in Madtown to the Badgers, taking on the number 7 Illinois Fighting Illini. It's not every time you have to say Ohio State's the underdog going into this rivalry. But Illinois improves to 8-0 and 4-0 in conference with a 31-13 win over the Buckeyes, effectively sealing the lead and keeping the Buckeyes out of their position. But it's not a done deal yet for the Illini, Danny.
Yeah, that for the Illini, they still got to worry about Indiana, who is still sniffing right outside of the Big Ten championship game. But who knows? But Illinois is looking very good, especially after this win. For Ohio State, must definitely be out of the race at this point, considering they have to now compete against Illinois and Indiana.
And don't forget, Ohio State, of course, has that game against Michigan, which might put them even further back. That game is now a do or die game for the Buckeyes. You always want to beat Michigan, but now it holds more weight than ever. Let's head over to our next set of scores. Let's head to Folsom Field in Boulder. The Colorado Buffaloes riding into this game not with the better record, but as the favorite. However, they would be relatively upset by Kansas. 57-24 the final score in this one. Kansas now technically in a tie with Colorado. Colorado since they have the extra conference win, they'll be on a bye next week, but they will hold on to the conference lead for now. They just need to hope that Kansas makes a costly mistake and loses another game in order to keep their conference lead. And right behind them is still Kansas State and Nebraska. The Wildcats have the edge between those two teams thanks to head-to-head. But now Kansas, we have to reach this point. Is Kansas a contender, Danny?
They could definitely be a contender. There's a lot of chaos that's going to be happening in the Big 12 soon. So let's see if Kansas can survive the gauntlet and hopefully come out on top, maybe.
Kansas, of course, not the first team you think of for football, to say the least. Let's head over to Yager Stadium in Oxford, Ohio. The Miami, Ohio Redhawks, hoping to avenge a loss previously to Kent State. They take on Northern Illinois, and from the get-go, this game wasn't even close. 61-33, one of the highest scoring combined games this season. NIU putting 60 on a team that has 6 wins is very impressive for them. NIU has always been on the outside looking in all season of the national championship talks. But if things go their way, could they make the national championship, Danny?
Potentially, but I do definitely think it's unlikely considering all the ranked teams who are right above them. So it's kind of been hard to tell if they will make it at all or not.
I think the biggest challenge for Northern Illinois is not even what lies above them, but who lies below them and who they face next week. They have a 7-1 team on their schedule, going by Central Michigan, who are looking to avenge losses in prior years and swoop the conference title from under them. That'll be a very interesting game next week. Let's head over to Louisiana Monroe. The UL Monroe Warhawks, who are having a pretty bad year, entering this game 1-6, taking on North Texas. We knew this game was most likely going to be a formality, but UL Monroe put up a decent performance, 34-24 the final score. But the big story, North Texas has now clinched the Sun Belt West Division. They're the first team this year to punch their ticket to the conference championship. Of course, Louisiana was sitting at second. The Mean Green beat the Raging Cajuns as their first conference win all the way back in week 3, I believe, which was the nail in the coffin. All North Texas had to do was maintain their momentum, and now they have it. They're 6-0 in conference, which is not an easy feat. They end their season with SMU. What are your thoughts on North Texas?
They could be the team to win in the Sun Belt, assuming that they can keep up their momentum, because there's still the heavy chance of either Coastal or FAU stealing it from right underneath them.
Mm-hmm. Let's head over to Kinnick in Iowa City. The number 11 Notre Dame Fighting Irish, continuing their winning ways, they take on the Iowa Hawkeyes. They take on the Iowa Hawkeyes and get punched in the mouth. The Hawkeyes were 2-5 entering this game, and they come away with a huge upset win, 37-33. Iowa pretty much out of the conference race at this point. But the Hawkeyes got the chance to play spoiler, and they relished in it in this game. Danny?
Yeah, that... excuse me. I mean, that for Iowa, they always know how to find some way to upset something, but they always... This time they got Notre Dame, and I'm sure this must be a huge shocker to Notre Dame.
This was a big
game, and potentially the Big Ten entirely.
Mm-hmm. Always a tough game, Kinnick on the road. No matter how good the Hawkeyes are, let's head over to our next game on the docket. The Dave Show Truckers, riding under the radar, they take on UCF. As UCF now picking up their 5th straight win. 27-24 the final, a very close game. A great Battle for Orlando rivalry classic as the Citronauts today pull through and win this game. Danny?
Yeah, that UCF, they are now riding the waves of college football. They went from 0-3 to now 5-0 in the last 5 games. So let's see how they do. And they are extremely close of punching their tickets.
Dave shows still a respectable record as well, but they have a tough stretch to end the year. UCF not as difficult, but but if they likely win their division, they have one of three teams to watch out for when they play in the conference title game. Let's head to Amherst, which you did spell incorrectly, but number 21 Syracuse, heading to Alumni Stadium to take on the UMass Minutemen, and the Minutemen improved to 7-1 after 3 overtimes. 46-44 the final. UMass quarterback Wesley Hayes balled out this game, which gave the Minutemen the edge. One of the highest scoring combined games we've seen this week. Always a classic game when both teams can put up 40 or more. What are your thoughts on this game and the Big East North race, Danny?
Yeah, with them beating Syracuse, I kind of knocked out Syracuse from the race, and now UConn and UMass, they're looking like they might have themselves the game of the century for the Big East, and whoever wins that game will definitely be able to fly to New Jersey to play whoever wins the South.
Mm-hmm. There is a name for that rivalry, but we're not going to say it on here. This is a family show. That rivalry between UConn and UMass. Let's head over to Houston, Texas. The Cougars. People had written them out of the division race, but they slip in a big upset over number 19 Memphis, 24-23. Always great to beat a rival. Even better when you can play spoiler. Now Southern Miss sits as the favorite to take the division. Danny?
Yeah, that now Houston finally has some momentum because we all remember their 1 point loss against Boise State, which I'm sure that game was really what pushed them to this limit to now beat at the time undefeated Memphis. So, and now the CUSA West, now we have a 3-way tie between Houston, Memphis, and Rice.
They're all tied for second. Rice is 3-1. They got a win over SMU. 3-1 in conference at least. Rice could make a bowl game. It would be their first since 2006. We'll head over to some Ivy League action, low scoring, hard-nosed football, just like in the olden days. Columbia pulling out a win over Brown. They improved to 6-2. But a bowl berth is not guaranteed in the Ivy League. Those games you gotta earn it, and Columbia slips into the lead. They are, by a huge margin, your favorites to win the Ivy League. Danny?
Yeah, that the Ivy League, they're still open. Like, anything can basically happen over there. So we have to really see what happens to them soon.
We'll move on to our last slide here. Memorial Stadium in Bloomington, number 17 Indiana hosting Penn State. You don't want to have what happened to Notre Dame happen to you, and it got close. It went to overtime. Indiana pulls through and wins 30-23, avoiding an upset scare over the Nittany Lions. We saw it happen to Notre Dame and Ohio State, but Indiana managed to slip ahead. They're now 6-3 on the season, clinching a bowl berth, but their race is not over. They gotta watch out for Illinois above them. Hope that they can get an upset win to try and defend their conference championship. Illinois hadn't won the conference hadn't won the Big Ten since the 1960s. They hadn't won the Big Ten since the 1960s. They haven't won it back to back since the 1930s. Danny?
Yeah, that this team, they are really, really pulling through, and well, we gotta really see about how they perform later on because a lot of things can happen.
Mm-hmm. Especially Indiana has a very tough schedule ahead of them. They have both Michigan and Illinois to worry about coming up. How about this game? Long Beach Stadium, or Veterans Memorial Stadium in Long Beach, California. Long Beach State, the beach, beating the Nevada Wolfpack, who were number 22, undefeated. They were looking like an unstoppable force in the WAC, but they get completely curb stomped here, 80-7, the final score, as that gives Nevada their first loss of the season, as Long Beach State clinches their first bowl win in nearly 25 their first bowl berth in nearly 25 years. The Beach are now 6-3 and currently tied for the division lead with Nevada. Danny, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for a lot of these teams, they are basically questioning now how much can they really go forward with this? Because I'm sure that Long Beach, they are riding high, like higher than anyone else before. But we gotta really see about how things perform later on, especially with how they're having themselves a very, very tough stretch later, especially with games including like San Jose State, UTSA, and their in-state rival Cal State Fullerton.
Mm-hmm. I also mentioned, I think Nevada, even in spite of this tough loss, they will likely be back. I still have them continuing their momentum and winning the division. But let's now move on to huge upset for Long Beach State. A huge statement win for USC. They take on Arizona State, a team on the outside of the rankings looking in. They started the season ranked, but they slipped out after their loss to Stanford earlier in the year. 36-23 the final. I know USC now proving that those big wins they've been accumulating aren't flukes. They can beat the big dogs in their conference. Their one loss this season was to Oregon, but they got a very tough game lined up for them against the Stanford Cardinal. How do you feel about this USC team in regards to their longevity in the conference championship race?
It's still a very big question mark because this is the Pac-10. There are no divisions, so practically anyone could still make it in, or anyone that's like top 5 could still make it in. But USC, they look pretty close, but they just got to really worry about Oregon, considering that Oregon does break ties.
Mm-hmm. They need another big upset loss for the Ducks in order to clinch, in order to take a spot in the conference championship game. They could get a big upset next week with Stanford. That'll put them ahead. That'll give them a boost. But let's head over to our final game that we'll be focusing on in depth. 22-17, the Idaho Vandals head down to Aloha Stadium and hand the Hawaii Rainbow Warriors their second loss of the season. This Idaho team has been waiting to prove themselves all year, and they get their 7th win of the year, improving to 4-1 in conference and keeping pace with New Mexico State right above them. This Idaho Vandals team had a very close game with New Mexico State. They currently sit in second due to tiebreakers. How do you feel about Idaho and Hawaii's longevity in the WAC race?
This is gonna be like a really, really tough one for them, considering like they really need to hope that New Mexico State loses another game for them to even make a chance of jumping them. But since they are both eligible, that means they still have a very good chance.
Mm-hmm. As for Hawaii?
For Hawaii, this looks really bad for them because they already have a bad loss underneath them with, let me get this correct,
Long Beach State.
They do Long Beach State, which also really helps out Long Beach. And they do play against Nevada later on this year, so things are not looking easy for them.
Mm-hmm. Let's head to our next. Let's take a look at the overall scores here on Wednesday. Central Michigan got a big win over Toledo. That'll be what we're focused on. Eastern Michigan having a surprisingly good year as well. They get a win over Western. And Ohio continuing to win with a win over Kent State. Meanwhile, on Thursday, the big game, Missouri State upsetting Wichita State, 34-23. That Missouri Valley Conference, MVC, more various chaos. Let's head to Friday. USF, big win on the road, 36-24. things continue to get worse for the winless Arkansas Razorbacks. James Madison, close big win on the road against VMI. And those are the big games we'll highlight for Friday. Any other games stand out here, Danny, on the weekdays?
Yeah, for me, one of the big weekday games might actually have to be. I really want to give it to. I want to give it to Appalachian State against the Citadel. I mean, App State, they're still trying to get their momentum back to potentially win it, but as the games are going on, it looks like they're getting less and less likely. So they really need something to change for them.
They need a big shake up there. Let's head to Saturday. We'll go one row at a time as usual. Charlotte, big upset 27-23 at Heinz Field, taking down the Pitt Panthers. Virginia Tech getting an easy win 33-12 over Duke to keep pace with Oklahoma State and Boise State above them in the national championship run. 42-16, Baylor gets a big win over one of the few not very good teams in the Big 12 in Iowa State. Tennessee 38-27 win over Tulane. Louisville getting their flow back, beating East Carolina 42-17 as ECU continues to drop games. Wisconsin, close game but not enough to beat the Michigan State Spartans. Texas upsetting Kansas State 16-10 to keep pace in the Big 12 South. I already mentioned the Rutgers Temple game. Coastal Carolina continues their unbeaten streak with a win over Middle Tennessee State. Meanwhile, we mentioned the Howard Richmond game. Any big games in column 1 here, Danny?
Let's hear that. One of the big games for me, it would probably have to be the UAB against Cincinnati. I mean, those teams, they were really trying to find like their first big win in conference, and now those two teams finally got their chance, or more like UAB got their chance. And for Cincinnati, they were projected to be one of the best teams in the CUSA this year, and here they are only one win.
We'll move on to our second row here. Georgia Tech 33-9, getting an easy win over the Vanderbilt Commodores. Nebraska, their win didn't come easy. 24-18, they beat Texas A&M. Florida State, a bit of a scare, but they pull away late over Virginia 41-34. Navy getting a win in overtime, a rare win. They take down St. John's. North Carolina wins 44-10 over the South Carolina Gamecocks on the road. Arkansas State, on a game-winning field goal, gets the upset win over Louisiana Lafayette. Northern Iowa lays a beating down on North Dakota. McNeese State upset on the road by Nicholls State. We'll talk about a big performance in that game later. Georgetown puts up a good effort, but it's not enough to beat West Virginia. They take the win 38-27. Harvard gets a 20-16 close win over Cornell. And we already mentioned the North Texas game. Big games in column 2 here.
Yeah, for me, one of the bigger games here would definitely have to be, at least in my opinion, would probably be Georgetown, West Virginia. I mean, West Virginia is still also trying to find their momentum, and Georgetown, they might not have the record might not be good, but some of their performances have been quite impressive. I mean, having close losses against teams like, of course, West Virginia's one of them, but also against Brown, and even having big wins against Boston College and currently number 2 in their division, Villanova.
I'm kind of surprised Villanova's doing as well as they are. But let's head over to our third column on this slide. Liberty getting a close performance, but not enough to beat out of nowhere Cinderella story William and Mary. 34-20 the final there. We mentioned the Florida-Georgia game. Georgia laying down a beating on the Gators, 28-3. Rice continues a very good season, 26-19 over SMU. Southern Miss gets a surprising scare from Southern, but they easily pull away in the second half, 34-15. Going down, Clemson has a close win over Miami. In overtime, the Maryland Terrapins get another hard-fought win over NC State. We saw the Notre Dame Iowa upset earlier. New Mexico State. It's not every day you see New Mexico State only put up 20 points, but they take the win on the road over Texas State. And we'll wrap up with the 29-9 game as South Dakota tries to close the gap in the Missouri Valley West Division with a win over Southern Illinois. Big games in column 3, Danny?
Yeah, just to reiterate the New Mexico State game, I mean, we're so used to seeing them scoring like 40 to 50 points each game, so to see them only score 27, I think there's one impressive defensive performance by Texas State, and maybe that's showing some cracks, maybe?
It's rare to call a 20-7 game impressive for the home team, for the losing team, but this is just the kind of team New Mexico State is. We got one more column here on our final slide. Delaware losing 36-14 to a very great UConn team, continuing to roll through the Big East. UNLV hosting the TCU Horned Frogs, and they basically raided Allegiant Stadium, 44-10 the final there. Wyoming getting a big blowout win over Eastern Washington, 59-10, and the Eastern Washington Eagles are the first team this season to go minus 300 in point differential. Oregon State getting a 40-24 win over UCLA. UTSA putting 60 on a Cullen Payton team at home. They're trying to fight for bowl eligibility. Utah on the road at Air Force Academy. They take down AFA 28-21 on the road. Fresno State getting a blowout win over CSU Fullerton. Stanford putting up 79, almost getting 80 points on the road against Arizona. And BYU 55-10 over Southern Utah. Danny, what are your big takeaways from this column?
For me, I think the one game that was really much basically a tune-up was the BYU game, because next week BYU has potentially the toughest game that anyone could ever have. Them playing against Boise, so this was them really preparing themselves.
Mm-hmm. Always good to have a preparation game. They actually host Boise, so that atmosphere will definitely be electric for that game. We'll now take a look at the race to the conference championship. The picture here is showing Iowa with their big overtime win at home over Notre Dame. That definitely shook up the race in the Big Ten. Let's take a look at our first thing. I also have percentages that I calculated on the side here for each team's likelihood to win the conference, which I'll be referencing. We'll start with the ACC. Virginia Tech, very much the favorite to play in the conference championship. They have a 57% odd right now. They're at 57% right now. North Carolina sitting at second at 30%. Florida State falling to 10%. Meanwhile, other teams still holding on by a thread are Clemson, North Carolina, and even Maryland, not still barely hanging on to their spot. Danny, what are your big picks here? I'm picking Virginia Tech and North Carolina to take the championship spots.
I will have to agree with you with those two picks. I mean, those two teams have looked the best as of right now, but Florida State, they still have this little potential chance of knocking out, especially with how they need basically North Carolina to lose one game for them to be in.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, let's move on to the Big East. The Big East North, currently a 50-50 shot for UConn. They're at 50% to represent the Big East North. UMass is second with a 35% odd. Syracuse down to 14 after their loss to UMass. And Rutgers currently with a less than 1% chance to make it. They would need everything to go their way. Right now, the favorite is definitely the winner, UConn UMass, and I'm picking the Huskies to take the win in that game. Meanwhile, the South, all but confirmed for Temple. They're sitting at a very clean 69% on top of the division. Villanova is second with 25%. West Virginia, though, is eliminated. They are not able to have a better record than Temple in conference, which means that since Temple beat them, they are out of the race. Meanwhile, Pitt and Charlotte are barely holding on to their chances. I'm picking it to be a matchup between UConn and Temple for the Big East Championship. Danny?
Yeah, I also have to agree with you with UConn against Liberty. Temple, sorry. But UConn, they do host UMass, so that's always going to be a plus for them. And also, they have themselves a very, very good game coming up with against Syracuse. So unless Syracuse decides to do something crazy, it's basically UConn's division to lose. And
Mm-hmm.
for the South, Liberty, they just almost are there to clinch it. They're just right there, like an inch away.
You mean Temple?
And Temple, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Big Ten
I
legends.
apologize.
With Notre Dame's loss to Iowa, it's now a wide open race. Notre Dame went from a 35% odds to now only at 30%. Now splitting that between Minnesota and Michigan, who are right behind them. Michigan State's odds have increased as well. Now, currently the favorite is still Notre Dame to win the division, but I'm not going to pick them. I'm picking Michigan to win some big games down the stretch and reclaim the Legends division. Notre Dame had a big slip up, and it's not going to get any easier for them with a team like Michigan State coming up on the schedule. As for the leaders, right now, Illinois, especially the favorite, thanks to Ohio State's back-to-back losses. The Illini are sitting at a 65% chance. Indiana is second with 23. Ohio State's at 10. Penn State effectively now eliminated after their loss to Indiana. My big pick, I'm picking Michigan and Illinois to rematch in the Big Ten title. Danny?
Yeah, that really is very interesting, but for me, in my opinion, I do have to say I'm definitely gonna pick maybe it's either Notre Dame versus Minnesota in the Legends, and for the leaders, I'm gonna have to go with a pick of maybe Michigan.
Michigan's in the Legends.
And the leaders, I mean Illinois. My brain's a little bit brain farty today.
We'll move on to the Big 12 now. The Big 12 is very brain farty. A very close race. Iowa State is the only team eliminated. Colorado is still on top in spite of their loss to Kansas, since they have a bye this week. They played one more game than Kansas did. Though Kansas with a win this week can take the lead and can tie the record and take the lead on tiebreakers, which a 7-win season for a 7-2 record for Kansas is practically unheard of. But also watch out, Nebraska, Kansas State are right behind them, and even Missouri is still in the hunt for the Big 12 North. I'm going to say Colorado and still ends up taking the division. I think Kansas will have a hard time with a team like Kansas State later on in the year. As for the Big 12 South, it's still an Oklahoma State race. 65% right now for the OKSU Cowboys. Baylor is still in double digits at 25. Meanwhile, outside of that, it's long shots. I'm picking it to be another matchup between the Buffaloes and the Cowboys. Danny?
For the South, it is definitely Oklahoma State. There's no doubt about that for me. And for the North, I'm gonna pick Kansas. Kansas still has that win against Colorado, so they still have that little one leg up.
Conference USA time. The UCF Golden Knights are currently 4-0. They're sitting at a cool 65% in conference with a 5-3 record. But watch out, two teams still in it are USF and UAB. Though those teams still have quite long shot odds. The big threat for this week Citronauts, but every other week Knights, is that game at the end of the year against USF. You gotta watch out for an upset, because also you gotta watch out for Rice, because Rice is picking up steam very much. if you slip up, or USF has Rice. Pardon me. No, you do have Rice. You have Rice USF back to back. Watch out for those two games. I could see Rice being a trap game for the Knights. And if you slip up twice, then USF leaps ahead and takes the division. But I'm still picking the Knights to take the Conference USA East. Or actually, before I get to Danny, we'll look at the West. Southern Miss now comfortably on top at 5-0 conference, 9-0 overall. The odds are still in favor. The odds are still in favor for Memphis. Are still relatively favorable for Memphis. They're bumped down to 35%. Houston is now at 15. Rice still in the race. But all three of them have a 3-1 record. Meanwhile, SMU effectively eliminated from contention thanks to their loss to Rice. I'm going to pick bold and pick Memphis to still take the division. I still think it's going to be Knights Tigers. Danny?
The Knights will definitely win the East, that's what I'm sure of. And you might also be seeing that Rice might be for you. So that's also a big game to watch out for. And for the West, I do think maybe Houston might actually have a comeback later on this year.
Yeah, quick peek at the Independents. Army still at 5-3. Pretty much not really anything changing there. Meanwhile, the Ivy League, Columbia now tied for the lead with Dartmouth. They get the edge with the overall record. Brown and Harvard are also 2-1. This conference has no title game. We can't really do odds in that sort of fashion. But Columbia, definitely the favorite to win the conference. But I'm going to pick bold, and I'm going to pick the Brown Bears. I think that loss is not indicative of that team. They could pick up a lot of easy wins, and Columbia has shown that their momentum to start the year is not always the great way to finish the year. Danny?
Yeah, for me, I think the two teams that might win the Ivy League might be, I would say, Dartmouth and maybe Harvard. Harvard really does have kind of an easy stretch later on, but they do have to play against any of these teams.
Let's head to the MAC. The MAC East is now Ohio's game, thanks to their loss to NIU. Miami, Ohio falls to 2-2. And interestingly enough, they swap odds with Marshall, who's 2-5 overall, but they are still 2-1 in conference. Ohio has the best odds at 60%, Marshall 30, and Miami, Ohio is at 17. Very bizarre odds to see, Danny. Or actually, hang on, hold that thought, Danny, because the MAC West is also happening right now. Northern Illinois and Central Michigan are far ahead, the favorites, but watch out. Eastern Michigan is gaining ground. They're 3-1. They're 3-1 in conference and 6-2 overall. The teams above them slip up even a little bit. Say Central Michigan gets a win. Say Central Michigan beats the Huskies. Eastern can swoop in and beat Central and Northern, as those are their last two games on the year, and Eastern could shock the country and slip into the MAC title game. Though I'm picking Central Michigan still to win the division and the conference in a title game over Ohio. Danny?
Yeah, that Marshall does play tomorrow, so we still gotta watch out for them. But in the West, I'm gonna say Northern Illinois wins against Central, and I'm gonna pick.
That's a good pick. Hang on. It was such a good pick, they didn't let you say it.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone, but yeah, I'm just a little reminder that Marshall does play tomorrow against, I believe it's Buffalo, who is also 2-1 in conference. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I will pick Ohio to win the East, and for the West, I think Northern Illinois will squeak out the win against Central.
Mm-hmm. Let's head to our next slides. The Missouri Valley, all over the place. Northern Iowa basically sealed the conference. There's 65% odds to win to win their division. Indiana State currently sitting at 20. Illinois State, Southern, and Western Illinois are all at 5%. Those odds will definitely those odds definitely will be leaning in the Panthers' favor. I'm picking them to win the East. In the West, Wichita State still, even in spite of their loss, heavy favorites to win the conference. North Dakota State is gaining a bit of ground though. They're currently 3-1 as well. South Dakota State sitting at 3-2. South Dakota is 2-2. They're at 25, 15, and 19% respectively. Missouri State, thanks to their win, they're not out of it. Since they beat Wichita State, they still hold on with just a fraction of a percent in the conference. But the fact that they're still here, even in spite of everything, is impressive. Danny, who you got? I'm picking Wichita State and Northern Iowa.
I will agree with you on those picks. The East, it's just Northern Iowa's division. Every other team there looks so disappointing. And in the West, I think it's definitely going to be Wichita. I mean, they do have the win against both of the South Dakota schools, so gotta really see how they perform soon against North Dakota State.
We'll head to the Mountain West. The Mountain Division still in the Mountain Division is still led by BYU, but they have their tough test. They got to play Boise. Their undefeated record likely will end this week, and Wyoming can slip in to take their spot. In spite of their one loss, they still hold the best odds in the conference or in the division to win. They're 3-1 with a 40% chance. BYU and Utah are both sitting at 15%. And Air Force is at 9%. The rest of the conference is just the rest of the division is just on the outside looking in. BYU's currently on the lead, but I'm picking Wyoming to win that division. Meanwhile, the West, it's a TCU Boise race. Both teams sitting at 45%. And San Diego State is sitting just barely around at 9%, and with less than a percent is New Mexico, who's 4-4 on the year. It's crazy that they're still in this. Danny, what are your thoughts in this race? I'm gonna pick Boise and Wyoming.
I think the game that's going to decide the North will be Wyoming at BYU. That's right after the Boise, but I think BYU will win the Mountain. And for the West, I'm going to pick TCU. TCU, they look really impressive. They're scoring a lot, and also not just that, but also they host Boise State later on this year.
Let's move on to the Pac-10. Currently on the two teams on top of the conference are Stanford at 5-0, with the big win over Arizona we saw, and then USC sitting at second with 7-1. They're 5-1 though. Oregon, if they pick up another win in conference, will have tiebreaker over USC, thanks to them beating the Trojans earlier on in the year. The current odds sit Stanford on the lead with 45%. USC is second with 30%. Oregon has 20%. Arizona State not out of it. They have a 20%, or they have a 9% chance, and with a fringe shot of about 2% is Washington. They can pull off a big upset against Oregon this week, though I don't know if they're going to be able to. I'm going to pick Stanford and USC. That'll be a big game to decide this week. But I'm going to say that USC pulls off a big upset, and I think that USC and Oregon will play each other in conference championship. Danny?
That's a good pick, but for Me, I'm gonna say it's gonna be Stanford against Oregon. Oregon's already got the tiebreaker against USC, so that really is already gonna be a big game to watch. And all Oregon has to do is just hope that Stanford beats them, and it is in Palo Alto, so
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the SEC. The SEC East, still a relatively open race. Currently on top of the division is Georgia Tech. Georgia is tied though. They both have a 4-0 conference record. Right on the outside also is Tennessee, sitting with I believe 2 losses. I had Excel on my side, it crashed.
oh yeah, don't worry, I got you that.
Tennessee is 6-2, 3-1 in
Tennessee
conference.
is at 2 overall losses, 1 conference loss.
Yeah, currently the odds favor Georgia Tech. They're sitting at a 50%. Georgia at 20%. Georgia's at 25% actually. Tennessee's at 20%. With about 5% odds is Florida, who just lost to Georgia. Their other 2 losses in conference were to Georgia Tech and LSU. So they would need Georgia Tech and Georgia to lose out in order to try and compete for the division. I think that Georgia Tech is still the best team in the SEC. As Pig Bear pointed out on last week's episode, they're his dark horse candidate for a national championship bid. I don't know if they're going to escape the SEC title game, but give me the Yellow Jackets to win the division. The SEC West, firmly LSU's division, 55% odds. Alabama is sitting at 25%. And surprising, Auburn is sitting at 15. Surprisingly enough, Ole Miss not out of it. They have a 5% chance. LSU plays Ole Miss on Halloween. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow afternoon. We'll be doing a stream for that game to see LSU potentially lock in the SEC West lead. I'm going to pick the Tigers to win that game and win the division to play Georgia Tech. Danny?
Yeah, for me, later on this season, we're gonna have a really good matchup between LSU Georgia Tech. So I think that game is gonna be rematched in Atlanta later this year for the conference championship.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at the SoCon. What started as us thinking a long shot scenario is now a runaway lead. William and Mary has gone from 0-3 to 5-0 -3, pardon me. 6-3. Yeah, what started as a long shot chance is now a runaway lead. William and Mary 6-3 on the year. They're currently well in command at a 55% chance to win the SoCon North. App State is second in spite of being quite further down on the rankings with 25%. Also watch out for James Madison sitting at 10%. 5% odds for both VMI and Richmond, though VMI may be eliminated next week. My big pick, of course, I'm going to pick William & Mary to finish out a Cinderella run to end the year. The South race in the SoCon is nearly settled at this point. Georgia Southern, 5-1, they clinch it with a win. They officially clinch it with a win against either William & Mary or App State. If they can beat either of those, they easily take it. They punch their ticket in. But if they lose out, there's still a chance for a team like Western Carolina, who is sitting at 15%. I think these games are actually really tough. And I think Georgia Southern might have issues down the stretch, but give me the Eagles to still win the South and get a rematch against William & Mary. Danny?
Okay, yep. So, okay. So that for me in the South, it's definitely Georgia Southern. And I remember at one point we were all thinking it's going to be App State against Georgia Southern again, but it's looking like William and Mary might do it. But who knows? Anything can happen soon. So yeah, so I definitely do think it's going to be Georgia Southern against William and Mary.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the Southland Conference. Currently on the top of the Southland East is now a tie. McNeese has the overall edge, so they do they have the overall edge? It's currently a tie between McNeese and Nichols. Nichols has the edge due to their game they played last week. Lamar and Southeast Louisiana are on the outside looking in. I don't have percentages for these actually, or for this one, but I'm gonna pick Nichols now to take the reins and win this conference. Meanwhile, let's head over to the South, which is a lot more heated of a race. Stephen F. Austin currently 8-0 on the year, 4-0 in conference. Sam Houston State is second, 7-1, 3-1. Sitting at 2-2 is Texas Arlington, Houston Baptist, Hardin Simmons, and West Texas A&M, who are all still in the race, just holding on by a thread. UTA has the best odds of the 2-2 teams, but I'm picking Stephen F. Austin to continue their role and get a matchup against Nichols in Frisco. Danny?
Yeah, for me, it's going to be the neutral site game in the last week between Stephen and Sam. Decide this. So who wins that might win it, but I'm thinking it might be Stephen and Austin will take it. And in the East, that one's extremely tough because all the top teams are at 2-2 in conference. So I'm gonna say maybe McNeese State returns back with it.
Mm-hmm. For those who didn't hear, he kind of glitched out for a second. He was talking about the game between Sam Houston State and Stephen F. Austin, played at a neutral site in Houston. We will move on to the Sun Belt Conference here. The SBC has been very close, especially in the East. Coastal is sitting on top of the conference, 8-0, 5-0 in the Sun Belt East Division. FAU can have the chance to take the lead and even maybe clinch the division with a win over Coastal this week. This would be their second win in a row in the Sun Belt East. As for the West, it's officially clinched, the first division to be clinched this season, with a 6-0 conference record. North Texas has the win. They take it from teams trying to vie for it like Troy, Louisiana Tech, and Louisiana, who falls to three losses in conference. And now it's a question of who plays North Texas, and I'm picking Coastal Carolina to roll through, and maybe even by a long shot finish the season unbeaten. Danny?
I do have to agree with you with Coastal. I mean, Coastal has much more productive offense than FAU, but it will be a tough game, especially since it is in Boca. So that game will definitely decide this division.
We'll move on to the WAC, the final conference here, which has been blown wide open thanks to Long Beach State. Long Beach State's currently sitting at second, or currently sitting actually in a tie in terms of the conference. Nevada currently still has the best odds with a 40%, but Long Beach State jumps up to 20 thanks to their thanks to wins over Hawaii and Nevada. Speaking of Hawaii still holding on with a 15% chance, even Fresno State holding on just barely, as does San Jose State. But I'm picking Nevada to pick things up and take control of the division once again. We'll move on to the Mountain Division. New Mexico State still on top, but tied now thanks to Idaho's win. They take the lead with tiebreakers over Idaho. But New Mexico State has a tricky end of schedule. You got to watch out for UTEP. UTEP is the type of team to steal some big wins. Of course against a rival it's always tough. But I don't think that's the toughest game on New Mexico State's schedule rounding up to the end. I think the most difficult challenge is at UTSA. UTSA has played remarkably well at home. So I think that New Mexico State struggles, but I still think they pull through and win the division. They play Nevada in a rematch in the conference championship game. Danny?
For me, I do think New Mexico State wins the Mountain, but for the Pacific, I'm gonna say Long Beach. I mean, it's gonna be hard for Nevada to recover from an 80-7 loss, so it's gotta be more impressive.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on from the conference championship standings to our teams that are bowl bound. We got so many they're getting hard to see. Our new teams this week: App State, FIU, Florida State, all are now bowl eligible, as Kansas, Long Beach, with big upsets they slip in, as does Nebraska, Northern Iowa, Temple, Texas Arlington, Tennessee, William and Mary, and Wyoming are all going bowling this season. Anyone here that's a big name that jumps out, Danny?
The biggest one would have to be probably Long Beach because we weren't really expecting them to make this kind of a jump, especially last year when they had like 3 wins, I think. So to see them get the bowling, that's really, really good for them.
I think a big surprise here is FIU. No one's really been talking about the Golden Panthers, but they're still keeping pace. If some chaos happens at the top of their division, they're right there to try and swoop it up. They could also play spoiler to FAU at the end of the year. We'll move on now to some teams knocking outside. Alabama still holding on. Army can clinch it with a win at Liberty. Auburn plays Florida to slip in. BYU has the toughest challenge to take on Boise State. UCF can clinch it with a win over Cincinnati. Clemson takes on Virginia. Georgia State has Louisiana Monroe right on the door. Houston takes on East Carolina. K-State has Missouri. Minnesota will win a bowl berth if they can win the jug. McNeese State, with an extra E, can clinch it with a win at Hardin-Simmons. Missouri is also playing for a bowl game as they're playing Kansas State. Northwestern can clinch it with a win on the road in West Lafayette against Purdue. Oklahoma can clinch it over Texas Tech. Ohio can take a big step in the division and clinch a bowl berth if they can beat Youngstown State on the road. Oregon State can climb from the bottom of their conference to slip into contention, to slip into a bowl game if they can beat Arizona State. Ohio State is right on the edge, but they have a bye this week. They have some games that they can clinch it later on in the year, though. Rice takes on Memphis to punch their ticket to their first bowl game since 2009, I believe. San Diego State can clinch one with an easy win over Eastern Washington. Rutgers and SMU both have byes, as does South Dakota State. Villanova can clinch their first bowl game in decades with a win over St. John's. Washington can clinch it if they play spoiler to Oregon. UTSA has UTEP on the road. Texas State has Tulsa to try and punch a bowl ticket for themselves, and I believe that's it. Danny, which team do you think has the easiest and the hardest road to a bowl berth?
The easiest team has to be San Diego State because Eastern Washington can't really do that. And for the hardest one would be BYU. I mean, they're playing against Boise State at home, loud atmosphere. It's going to be a really, really big game for them.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with this easiest game being San Diego State. I think the hardest is actually Washington. They head on the road at Oregon, Outson Stadium, probably one of the hardest places to play in the world, let alone the country. Getting a win there is borderline impossible. Also, mentioning your point about Long Beach State, they ended up 4-8 last season. We'll move on here to our Heisman Watch. We haven't had an update for this in a while. we will have our Heisman finalists in week 12, and we'll present them and we'll present the Heisman Trophy as well as other awards week 15. Don't forget to stay tuned for those. The current favorite right now is Oregon's halfback Terrence Noel, who's been the favorite almost all year since Oregon's electrifying performances this season. But it's gotten a lot closer. Mason Booth, the halfback for Oklahoma State, Marvin Walker, the QB for Stanford, Dominique Goodman, a surprising name out of Kansas, Trey Justice, the halfback from Georgia Tech, Javari Johnson, runner for Boise, Avery McKay, quarterback for TCU, Brandon Williams, the wide receiver for USC, Charlie Malone, quarterback for North Carolina, Michael Kelly, the quarterback for Virginia Tech, wraps us up. I would also like to mention two names on the outside looking in: Cameron Hansen, quarterback for NIU, and Wesley Hayes, quarterback for UMass, who's performed extremely well, especially under pressure. Who do you think is your Heisman vote here, Danny?
For me, it comes down to two teams for me, depending on how things go. It's either the halfback from Oregon, Terrence Noel, or I could say potentially every McKay, especially if they get the big wins against Boise State there on this year and maybe even a national championship.
They could get a championship berth if they beat the Broncos. My big pick here, I could see it going to Mason Booth, but I could also see them throwing a curveball and giving the nod to Dominique Goodman for how poorly the team was before he got here and how well they're doing now. That he's clearly one of the reasons why. Let's move on to the top 25. This has been a long stream, but we're finally here talking our top 25. Not much change at the top. Once again, the top 5 is stagnant. Oklahoma State, Boise, Vatech, LSU, and Northern Illinois are your top 5. But that could change next week. NIU plays Central Michigan. That could be a big upset. Also, LSU plays tomorrow night against Ole Miss. It's very unlikely, but I could easily see the Tigers taking a win. But I could still see the Tigers having the impossible happen and falling to Ole Miss. Danny, any scares that could possibly happen since it's Halloween?
For scares, that one might be tough. I mean, definitely Boise State might have themselves like the biggest scare later on, well, this weekend, but maybe LSU might get that big scare coming up in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the rest of our top 10. A bit of a shakeup. Stanford, Illinois, still 6 and 7. TCU making a jump. Georgia Tech is 9, and Baylor is sitting at your 10 spot. Baylor clawing back into the top 10. And my favorite team to potentially burst the Boise bubble is Illinois. Or the Illini, top team, still unbeaten. They could slip past a Stanford or an LSU. Maybe even crack past the Broncos and the Hokies to take the number 2 spot. Danny, what do you think?
Yeah, for me, I definitely do think a team who could maybe break out of this is either TCU or Georgia Tech. TCU has that big game against Boise State, which that's going to be a big prime game for them, and Georgia Tech, they play LSU later on this year, so they could easily just snap it out.
Mm-hmm. We'll move on to our next 5 up. Our next 5, number 11 is UConn. We were surprised a lot when Rutgers was ranking pretty high on their Big East title run. UConn is doing even more. They're knocking on the door of the top 10 right now. USC is sitting at 12. They got a big game against Stanford. Number 13 is Oregon. Still very much a contender in the Pac-10. Number 14 is North Carolina. They'll definitely have a date with Virginia Tech, most likely in the conference title game. And number 15 is Notre Dame, a team who ended up slipping after their loss to Iowa. Danny, any big stories in this 5?
Yeah, for me, I'm going to say it's probably going to be UConn since they are still undefeated. They're still rolling, and they're still beating teams by a good amount, so who knows?
Let's move on to the next 5 up. Number 16 is Michigan. a team still reeling from a loss to Illinois, but they have a very tough schedule, so no time to mope about. They gotta collect big wins where they can get them. Number 17 is now Southern Miss. Due to Memphis's loss, they're the only Conference USA team you'll see in this top 25. Number 18 is Georgia, who makes a big leap after their win over Florida. I expect them to rocket up the rankings due to being a one-loss SEC team. Of course, they would still hang around, but gotta watch out for LSU and Georgia Tech, of course. Number 19 is New Mexico State. Benefiting from Memphis dropping, they managed to move up a spot. Even with the loss, they still could slip into a BCS berth, but it's quite a long shot. They would need a team like NIU above them to slip out. And number 20 is Indiana, another mid-tier contender in the Big Ten, but they got a big date with Illinois later in the year to try and prove themselves. Danny, any big teams here that could cause some noise?
Yeah, for me, one of the big teams. I mean, this could be quite tough, but I'm gonna probably say Georgia. I mean, they got that big win against Florida, a dominant win, to say frankly. And who knows? Maybe they might be the team to upset the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets.
They'd be the first. Let's move on to our next five, the final five here in the top 25. Number 21 is Coastal Carolina, the 8-0 Sun Belt team. This is their first year in the Sun Belt, and potentially their last. They have been in talks to return to the SoCon in the near future. As for number 22, Tennessee, rolling back into public conscience. Even in spite of dropping out for a week, there's still a potential scare in the SEC. Number 23 is Stephen F. Austin, another non-BCS team who's been performing extremely well. Number 24, you're not going to believe this. We've had a lot of weird teams that you wouldn't expect in the rankings in 2KU, but this is Kansas, baby. We've gone full weird now. The Jayhawks are currently your favorites to win the Big 12 North, which is crazy to say. And number 25 is UMass. Finally, after weeks of bubbling under, they finally slip into the top 25, and they have a big date at the end of the year with UConn. Big teams here, Danny?
Yeah, for me, one of the big teams might be. I think it would probably be Stephen of Austin still. I mean, no one performed quite well, and to see them here, it's really impressive. And another team I like to shout out is Coastal, making a good jump from one conference to another.
I'd also like to mention last year Stephen F. Austin was 3-9 on the year, 3-5 in conference. To see them go from a sub 500 season to in the top 25 is quite an incredible jump. Let's now move on to the teams also receiving votes. Central Michigan, right there. They'll probably be in the rankings if they can win next week. Memphis dropping out, as is Nevada. I expect those two teams to be back very soon. Even in spite of their losses, they're still some of the best teams outside of the top five, outside of the big conferences. Also, watch out for Temple, 6-2. They could slip in by conference championship week. Idaho, 7-2. Georgia Southern is 8-1. Colorado, 6-3. The lone power team still in the others receiving votes. FAU is 7-1. Who do you think is going to be back or will be making their first appearance in the top 25 here, Danny?
Definitely watch out for Temple. I mean, they are really knocking right out there, so I could definitely see them making the jump in. Potentially, maybe even Idaho or Georgia Southern, considering they both have really good records as of now.
I think Georgia Southern might not because of how tough their schedule is coming up. I don't know if they can keep this momentum up with teams like William & Mary and App State still on their schedule. We'll move on to our players of the week. Jack Gomez went 25 for 27, a near perfect day for the UCF Citronaut QB. He had 266 yards and 3 touchdowns. Wesley Hayes threw 4 touchdowns and 3 overtimes. with 290 yards in the win over Syracuse. Shelton Woodard, this is a running back from Drake. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he had 3 touchdowns and 231 yards on the ground in a win over Indiana State. But my big pick is Dante Richard. This is the wide receiver from Nichols State. The Colonels got the win over McNeese State in an upset. 7 receptions for 160 yards and 4 touchdowns for one receiver. That's about as insane as the player last week who had 3 sacks and 3 picks. Danny, your thoughts on these players?
Yeah, it's good to see players perform really well, especially when it's like games that they really need to win. So, yeah, good for them. And also, good shout out to Nichols for them getting themselves a major win.
Mm-hmm. We'll now look at our games to watch. Finally starting to wind down here. We got Memphis heading on the road to take on a white-hot Rice team. Of course, Rice would be white-hot. Georgia Tech taking on Tennessee. Tennessee hoping to play spoiler in the Big East, or in the SEC East, pardon me. USF and Dave Show. If you're a fan of the Truckers, you gotta look out for USF Dave Show every single year. You never know what's gonna happen in this game. Doesn't matter if these two teams were 11-1 and face each other or 1-11 face each other. They would still be playing hard. They would still be playing some of the most exciting football around. Wisconsin will be heading on the road to take on Penn State. Not that big a game in terms of records, but the atmosphere will definitely be intense for this one. Syracuse and UConn. UConn trying to make it official and set the date for their matchup with UMass, and the step to do that is to take down Syracuse. Auburn and Florida, one of the lesser talked about rivalries in the SEC, but that'll definitely be a great game to watch. TCU having what I think will be a surprisingly tough test in Utah. Watch out for that game. Boise State and BYU. Both TCU and Boise are going to be tested by some of the best teams in the mountain. Central Michigan, Northern Illinois. This was a candidate for a while for our 2KU Saturday's location. You got to watch out for this game. NIU trying to continue their winning streak. Central Michigan trying to get revenge for back-to-back losses that cost them conference championship appearances. USC Stanford. There's not a name to this rivalry, but both of these teams have been very good for a long, long time. So this game has huge implications for the Pac-10 championship race, as does Washington at Oregon. Washington very much on the outside of the race, but who knows, they could be the team to play spoiler. Michigan State and Notre Dame are playing for a Megaphone Trophy out in South Bend. This game looks more wide open than ever thanks to Notre Dame's loss to Iowa, and Michigan State has been picking up some wins and stealthily becoming a dark horse candidate in the Big Ten Legends Division. The Little Brown Jug, a personal favorite rivalry of mine, Minnesota, taking on the Michigan Wolverines. That's going to be a great game. And Coastal Carolina and FAU, a combined 1 loss and 15 wins between these two teams, and this will decide most likely the SBC East Division. What are your big games here?
Yeah, for me, the games I'll definitely be watching out for would be Boise State BYU as, of course, one of them, because that's always going to be a big rivalry game in the Northwest. And I really do also love the Brown Jug. I mean, one of the oldest rivalry games in the Big Ten. Gotta always watch it.
Yeah, but the game we're gonna pick here for our 2KU Saturdays is gonna be USC, the number 12 team in the country, heading up to Stanford. Pac-10 championship preview. Who knows? We'll have to see. The USC Trojans have vastly improved this season. They only ended up going 7-6 last year. Stanford having a bit of a disappointing year with only 1 loss, but they beat Oregon in order to hold on to the conference lead. Can they seal their spot in the conference championship game, or will USC leapfrog the Ducks in order to slip into the race for San Francisco. We'll have to see in this one. Who are you picking in this game, Danny?
Me, I'm gonna pick Stanford Cardinals. They're playing at home. It's big atmosphere, rivalry game. So I'm expecting the Cardinals to win it out.
The Stanford Cardinal have won the last 4 in this rivalry, including last year. That streak ends this year. I'm picking USC to win this in an upset, and I pick both these, and I think both these teams can still win out and play each other in the conference championship game. I am going to end that here. Thank you all for watching. That'll do it for another episode of 2KU Weekly. We'll see you in the near future. Don't forget to tune in tomorrow afternoon for our LSU Ole Miss matchup on Halloween night. Also, don't forget to watch out on the channel for the 2KU basketball preview, the 2KU preview basketball episode, as well as our. Don't forget to follow our Tumblr for more updates and fun stuff like this. We'll see you all around. Any last notes for everybody?
Nope, that's gonna be it. So thank you all for watching. We hope to see you guys next time.
And don't forget to have an awesome Halloween. See ya.